Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased this evening to welcome Ethan Chatagnier, Aimee Pokwatka, and Stephanie Feldman to At Home with Literati this evening to discuss their recent novels, which are just out last month. Just a quick webinar overview for those of you who are just joining us this evening. The chat is closed, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase books from Literati throughout the event. And the Q&A feature is available to you tonight. Whenever you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A. I'll ask your questions on your behalf at the conclusion of the conversation this evening. And live transcription is available to you as well using the CC icon. If you are watching us live on YouTube, watching us not live, but much later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You can also click on the little typewriter icon here and subscribe to our channel and be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available on our channel at a later date. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we would just like to thank you this evening for your attendance, or this morning, or much later this evening, or tomorrow, or 2 years from now, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us from. So without further ado, I'll introduce tonight's authors. Ethan Chatagnier is the author of the story collection Warnings from the Future. The stories have appeared in the Kenyon Review Online, Georgia Review, New England Review, and other journals, and have been awarded a Pushcart Prize and listed as notable the best American short stories. He lives in Fresno, California with his family. Aimee Pokwatka grew up in Wheeling, West Virginia. She studied anthropology at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and received her MFA in creative writing from Syracuse University. Her work has been published in Fairy Tale Review, Outlook, Springs, Hunger Mountain, and elsewhere. She lives in New York with her family. Self-Portrait with Nothing is her debut novel. And Stephanie Feldman is the author of the debut novel, The Angel of Losses, is a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer Selection, winner of the Crawford Fantasy Award and finalist for the Mythopoeic Award. She's co-editor of the multi-genre anthology Who Will Speak for America, and her stories and essays have appeared in Asimov's Science Fiction, Catapult, Electric Lit, the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, The Rumpus, and Volume 1, Brooklyn. She lives outside Philadelphia with her family. Please welcome all tonight's authors into your living rooms.
Hi, and thank you.
Hello, gang. Thank you for having us.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining.
This is fun. The three of us have been talking online for months, I think, getting ready for our book launches, but this is the first time that we're all speaking live. I was going to say in person, but it's not.
But it feels, it feels like we're in person more than
First time going audio visual. Yeah.
Yeah. So we were going to start tonight by telling you a little bit about our new books. And Ethan, since you were introduced first, why don't you begin?
Sure. Happy to. So I'm Ethan Chatagnier. This is my book, Singer Distance. And it's kind of a sci-fi literary hybrid. And the premise is that in the early 1900s, Earth and Mars communicate, but Mars only communicates with us a little bit. They're not very interested, and they only respond when we solve one of their mathematical proofs. So this is about a group of grad students in the 1960s who think they've solved the proof that's been eluding mathematicians for decades, and they go to try to put that to the test. And I will pass it off to Aimee, who is introduced next.
Okay. My debut novel is Self-Portrait with Nothing. And it's a story of an artist, the disappearance of an artist named Ulla Frost, who is famous for the claims that her portraits draw forth their subjects' doppelgangers from alternate universes. And her biological daughter, whose name is Pepper, who following Ulla's disappearance is named Ulla's sole heir, and becomes really embroiled in the search for what happened to Ulla, which for Pepper is not so much about actually what happened to this mother she's never known, but really more about why this woman abandoned her the way she did, how much of what Pepper dislikes about herself comes from this person that she never knew, and also, whether that whether it really is true that there are versions of her in other universes that might actually be happier and more fulfilled, even though she doesn't really believe in alternate universes.
Characters are always running into what they believe versus what we've decided is real.
Yeah.
So I'm here to talk about Saturnalia, my second novel, which came out at the beginning of October. And Saturnalia takes place in a near future-ish alternative Philadelphia that's a lot like the real Philadelphia, but a little bit more climate wrecked. And it's also a Philadelphia that celebrates this wild winter solstice carnival, Saturnalia, after the ancient Roman festival. And this carnival is organized by these elite social clubs, kind of like Mardi Gras cruise, but like a little bit evil, as it turns out. And my main character, Nina, is a former member of one of these clubs. She left after she was betrayed by her boyfriend there, who is now running the show. But she agrees to come back when a friend asks her to go pick up a box that he's hidden beneath the library floorboards. And she doesn't want to go back to the club, but he's offering a cash reward and she's broke. So she agrees to do it and goes to the big winter solstice masquerade. And of course, it's never as easy as just picking up a box and heading out to your rendezvous. So she gets drawn into this conspiracy and conflict between these secret societies who are all using alchemy and other kinds of magic, trying to find a way to survive in this very unstable world. So that's Saturnalia. I don't want to jump the gun because we're all here to talk about speculative lit and bending genre and moving between genres. So maybe to start, I would ask, if you were thinking about genre when you were writing your book, if you were aiming for a certain genre or multiple genres, or how you ended up telling this kind of story.
So I'll chip in first, I guess. I started with the premise on Singer Distance, where I had this idea of a Mars that had a civilization that wasn't interested in us, and I was really pulled into that idea of a civilization, an alien civilization that's that close, but is also very distant. And so that intrigued me to start writing about that idea, and naturally that automatically kind of places it in sci-fi if you've got aliens and we're talking to them. But I wanted to explore it in kind of a literary way. I wanted to do it kind of like how Kazuo Ishiguro does these things with a different world, but it still feels very much like it's a twist on the real. So it was hard to place. I feel like it's still a little hard to place now. And so I just feel like it's kind of a mix of the two, of a sci-fi novel and a literary novel in ways that bleed together rather than have like a clear line between them.
Yeah, I think we all share that we're all kind of like hard to define. For me, my path was very similar to Ethan's in that I had an idea, like a premise. Like I've always been obsessed with doppelgangers. My entire life, everybody has always told me, I know somebody who looks exactly like you. I was at the grocery store and I saw your twin. I'm always like, there is a doppelganger, at least one of me out there. I remember hearing the word doppelganger for the first time, like on Twin Peaks. So, but I couldn't really figure out how to tell a story with doppelgangers. And really the lens kind of came through a much more human story, and kind of two prongs. One was that I became really obsessed with the idea of art monsters after reading Jenny Offel's Department of Speculation, especially because she talks about how women rarely get to be art monsters. It's always like Nabokov, who has Vera licking his stamps for him, and the women are like, doing the actual work of running the household while that happens. So I really wanted to write an art monster, and not just like a woman who was like, I don't want to like raise kids, but somebody who did something like actually monstrous seems more interesting to me. But also I was really thinking a lot about like motherhood, which is scary. I'm pretty sure neither of my parents are logged in, so I can be like, there's been times in my life when I did not want to have a conversation with my mother. Mothers are scary. But also from a personal perspective, like it was a point in my life where my kids were starting to be like people. And I saw that they were like me in ways that I did not expect. Like, when you have a conversation about like a choice and whether it might screw your kid up, you're always like, okay, but like we're probably still screwing them up in ways that we don't realize, and sometimes by virtue just of giving them our DNA. So I really thought that, the idea of how much we get from our parents, how much of that is unexpected, was kind of really what informed the actual story as it unfolded. But also in terms of genre, as I started writing, I was thinking about mystery because the plot was really based on mystery, like a mystery story. So I did kind of pull on that more than I did on like, sci-fi.
That's so funny because I was just writing a craft essay, or rather it came out a couple of weeks ago. Sorry, time has no meaning anymore. But I was writing about how often I think of a story as a mystery, whether it, is a crime story or, someone gets killed or whatever. It's always kind of, characters trying to discover something. And I think Singer Distance is kind of a mystery too. Saturnalia could be a mystery because Nina's trying to figure out what all these people are up to. I started with questions about climate anxiety and what happens when, maybe this sounds familiar to you, but what do you do when it feels like the world is like slowly but steadily falling apart around you, and you're almost afraid to like check the news when you wake up in the morning because something really bad could happen while you were sleeping, like maybe on Twitter, I don't know. And so that's really what I was thinking about, but I leaned into telling this story that has some monsters in it and dark magic. And I think I really felt set free because this is my second book. And with my first book, I really thought of it as a literary book, whatever that means, kind of a Gothic inspired tale about a family with some magic and fairy tales in their history. And it ended up getting attention from fantasy readers. And they really got the book. And I read pretty widely, but I hadn't read a lot of fantasy at that point. And I was just like, oh, okay, like this is what I'm doing. Great. So when I started writing Saturnalia, I was like, I'm going to lean into it. My main character is a fortune teller. Like I said, I draw on alchemy to create some non-human-ish monsters. There's one right here. And but then when I was done, the editor that I ended up working with was like, it kind of seems like horror. How do you feel about leaning into the horror of it? And I said, yeah, I love horror. I've been writing a lot of short fiction that falls into the horror realm with ghost stories and things like that. So when it comes to genre, I feel like I've just kind of been sliding around. And when I write, I should be thinking about it more. We have the same agent, so she would probably tell me to think about it a little more. But I sort of do the same thing where I'm like, oh, I got this great idea and, it's weird and it's supernatural and I just want to see where it goes. And, I'll worry about what to call it later.
Yeah, this is actually something that I wanted to ask about because, I think a lot of times like the appeal of using like a genre element or a fantastical element is that the same way that you would use like a fairy tale, there is kind of like a social history. Like we recognize those characters, we recognize those elements, and it's kind of something that connects the reader to the story or the viewer to the story. And so this is kind of like a two-part question. Ethan, like, how did you think about like the history of these kind of like first contact stories? But also Stephanie, I'm very curious because I feel like readers are very, familiar with like an alien culture and like the multiverse, but maybe not so much a homunculus. And I'm curious, like if you were like trying to think about how like a reader might be coming to that without like the same kind of background that they might to other elements.
For me, because mine's sort of an alternate history that ended up being a really good kind of guide. I got to think about like when were certain things happening in astronomy? When did we start, launching stuff into space? And naturally, that's kind of a constraint because I have to stick to some of those timelines. But it's also just a really good guideline. I get to hop on and mix some of that with a little bit of invented history, and it kind of, I think, ups the feeling of realism. I hope so. And so it was really good to do that. And it also let me access kind of the feeling of the space age, and that I think we've all got a lot of nostalgia for the space age, but it was that time of kind of great excitement and wonder at the universe. So it was really nice to be able to connect to that and feel like it kind of juiced up the setting and the atmosphere of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah, Aimee, you said the H word, homunculus. So homunculus is like a tiny little human. And it figures into alchemy and alchemical lore. So that's one of the first like weird things that my main character encounters and realizes that the world is not what she thought it was. And it was actually one of the first things that inspired the book. There's homunculus in Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum, which I read at a very young age, and I think it like imprinted on my brain. So there are secret societies in that book, and I wanted to write about secret societies like that. And then I love this figure of the homunculus. I just thought it was so weird. And maybe this, is kind of a key to my approach in all this discussion. But I was like, yeah, that's super weird. Like, I want to write about that weird thing that maybe not everybody has read about or used. So that was really one of the first inspirations for me. And I did not think about what will readers think. And a lot of early readers were like, it was like shocking to them and they weren't sure what to do with it. But I think as a reader myself, I love to be surprised, especially by, strange images and lore. So to me, that was an exciting piece, to fuel the story. And you said you love doppelganger. So were you thinking of other texts with doppelgangers that you wanted to engage with or do your own versions of?
Not really. I mean, I did own Sliding Doors on VHS, so I am like definitely steeped in that lore. Like in one of the first books that really like made me want to write about alternate universes was A Tale for the Time Being, which deals with it in like a very different way. I think for me, a lot of times, like when we're thinking about how the genre elements function in a book, it's like you really need to have, for me at least, unless you're writing like a fairy tale type vibe and you want like flat characterization, for me, I feel like it's very helpful to have a lot of psychological realism to anchor the kind of fantastical elements. And that was really what I was most interested in exploring in terms of alternate universes. And I mean, I think there is stuff out there that does that, but that, not all of it. So that was really kind of what attracted me to that element.
The unusual creatures, like the monster and the homunculus, I won't say what the monster is, it should be a surprise, were one of the things I loved about Saturnalia, because it's just like, okay, I've heard of a homunculus before, the other one I had no idea about, but I hadn't seen either of them used in a book. And so it felt really like fresh and unusual and surprising, and you didn't know where it was going to go in the way that you would if it were some of the more familiar creatures. And like vampires and werewolf stuff, that can all be still done really well. But it's very cool to see something that brings in creatures outside that. And similarly, in Self-Portrait with Nothing, I feel like, I've seen a lot of multiverse stories, movies, comics, all that stuff, but this felt totally unfamiliar to all that. It felt like a totally different take on the multiverse type of story. So I was wondering, as you guys set out on these stories that have, kind of elements that have been done in other works or other variations before, were there certain things that you wanted to avoid, like roads that you didn't want to take?
Well, I think I guess I didn't have anything specific that I was trying to avoid, but I did sort of take care with my research, because my instinct is to read everything. And then once I read something that I think is cool, I want to incorporate it, which is a real challenge as a writer. It's really like you're digging a hole for yourself. So when I was reading about alchemy, pretty quickly I stopped, because you could read about alchemy forever. There's so much out there. And I found like a few pieces that I felt were really essential, and I decided to just develop the rest on my own as best I can, and to let my imagination fill it in instead of drawing too much on what was already there. And that maybe that would help me not just finish the book, but also avoid using these creatures or these ideas in ways that someone else already had.
Yeah, I think for me, it's not necessarily something that I was trying to avoid, but I think in a lot of alternate universe stories, the allure the payoff is getting to see what is happening in other universes, and especially Everything Everywhere All at Once. Like we get to see like the characters like different lives, and in my book, we do get a little glimpse of that, but I think I was really trying to resist giving into that seduction so much, because ultimately like we can't really know like what we would be like if we had made a different choice. So I think a lot for me was kind of resisting that desire and kind of saying, no, we can't know that, just as we can't like really know our mothers entirely. That kind of inability to understand something and how frustrating that is something that unfortunately I think is also sometimes frustrating for readers, but something that I wanted to explore.
Yeah, I like that. I feel like a lot of times you have to find your way by thinking like, no, if I go this way, it's going to be too predictable or too much like this other thing that's already been done. So.
Yeah.
I think this is a question that comes up in all kinds of fiction too, because I teach a fiction workshop at the Arcadia University MFA program. And so we talk, all the time about what a reader needs to know in a story. And, for us here, that could be about the rules of our universes. But ultimately, a reader only needs to know enough information so they understand the character's decisions and the stakes, to use a very MFA workshop term, and what the character wants and why and how they're going about getting it. And I'm kind of reluctant to make proclamations about what one genre does or another genre does, because I think these categories are very blurry and there's a lot of overlap. But it could be that in something that lands more firmly into fantasy or the fantasy end of the spectrum, there is more time spent on explaining or developing a mythology. And there's a lot of joy in that. I love doing that. And I love reading books like that as well. But I think in all of our work, we pulled back a little bit and explained less.
There's this fantasy term, like a low magic world. Like Game of Thrones starts out in a low magic world where it's not just like wizards who can cast whatever spell they want all the time, but sometimes people will try something and sometimes something will happen. And I feel like that's kind of like the take each of us have on our elements, where there's not like this specific system people can follow and know exactly what's going to happen, but it's all a little bit like mysterious how the multiverses work and interact in Aimee's book, and how the arcane magic works and when it does, when it doesn't. Like it's very, you don't know how it's working, but that adds to the mystery.
Yeah. Actually, I listened to this Katie Mack podcast she was on recently, and she was talking about like, the universe, and the interviewer kept asking her questions, and Katie Mack would be like, I don't know. We don't know. And it really struck me how many answers were, we don't know the answer to that question. And really what like a lot of the physicist's jobs is to like just sit in the mystery of the universe, and maybe you can answer one tiny little question, but you have to be able to like accept the fact that there are a lot of things that we will never know. And I think that that's something that using those genre elements kind of allows us to explore too.
It's also just a theme across all three books. Like the Martians are so frustrating. The point, like that's because it's the book is not just about this world or this universe where there's a Martian civilization that is communicating and fits and starts with the Earth population, but it's about a relationship and how hard it is to know your partner, or for Aimee's book, how hard it is to know your mother. And Saturnalia, it's about knowing the future. People like desperately want to know the future, and you can't. You just have to figure out a way to keep going without that knowledge.
Yeah. Stephanie, you said something earlier about how when you were writing Saturnalia, you kind of went toward like the things that you like to read yourself, which is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. So I'm curious, like, what are you reading? What are the things that have really like sparked your imagination and that you have gotten excited about recently, or that were relevant to, your own books?
Yeah, I can't remember what I was reading when I started writing this. It was 2017-ish or 2018, which is like the ancient past. I do keep a list of what I read. I should go back and look. This fall, I've been reading a lot of horror books and new books. One of the fun things that I had forgotten about putting out a book is you get to be part of this community of authors who are releasing books in the season. And so you get to see what they're doing and read all this like great new literature. I just was very lucky to get an arc of Mariana Enriquez's novel, Our Share of Night, which is going to be her first novel out in February, and a very kind bookseller lent it to me. And it was very good. She wrote, I'm blanking on the names, but she has 2 story collections that I guess she's a horror writer, but I also think she's kind of a crossover writer too in who reads her. Like I think she was longlisted for a Booker or something like that. So I just read her book, and it's very good. I'm very excited to read Usman Malik's story collection, Midnight Doorways. It just won the World Fantasy Award. That's next on my list. So what about you guys?
For me, when I worked with short stories for a long time, and I was would always try and start out a novel and feel like it was a bad idea after a little while and drop it. And the thing that kind of unlocked the novel writing process for me was getting into Ishiguro. And sorry, I know I need to not talk about Kazuo Ishiguro all the time, but I love the way the premise of his book kind of contained the whole story in a way, and that let me feel like I started, like I could understand how to write a book like that. Not as good as that, but in that direction. And so that was a big thing for me. And when I start on a novel, it seems like it's usually where I feel like I've got something that's like an Ishiguro and premise, and then I proceed forward and fall short of it, which is fine because I'm never going to write a book like that. But it helps me just feel like, okay, I can kind of see enough direction about where this is going. But then as I was writing, I was leaning a lot toward The Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang, which was made into the movie Arrival. And it tells kind of a similar story. His is kind of smarter. He's a very, very detailed writer, and he gets into complexities of linguistics and physics and all kinds of stuff like that. But it felt like I wanted to aim for that kind of story.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say, you can't write the same book as Ishiguro. When I was in grad school and I was had a workshop with George Saunders, and he would do this thing where he would like draw a mountain on the board and then put like a little stick figure at the top, and then he would be like, this is Toni Morrison. This is Toni Morrison Mountain. You cannot get to the top of Toni Morrison Mountain because Toni Morrison is always at the top, is already at the top of this mountain. So that I literally sometimes in my notebook when I'm starting something new, like draw a little picture of like Ann Patchett, like Aimee, you cannot get to the top of Ann Patchett Mountain because Ann Patchett is already there, or like Kelly Link Mountain. Or so there are definitely people who like, I definitely like Kelly Link is one of those for me. Like I love and admire everything she writes. And I kind of try to think about her work in terms of like, she is as Kelly Link as she can be. How can I be the most myself that I can be? I'm not sure. I always try to like avoid reading anything that's too close to what I'm working on while I'm working on it, because I feel like I'm just so impressionable. But one book that I was really thinking about while I wrote it was, and it's a very different book, which is Remainder by Tom McCarthy, which is a book that kind of takes this idea, this guy who's trying to recreate a memory, and takes it so much further. It takes the premise all the way to the end. Like you go all the way to the end of the road with it. And I was really fascinated by the way that he like played that out all the way through to the inevitable, like to a conclusion that like goes beyond what I would have expected. So that's something that really was on my mind during the process of writing this. Like if I took this premise, how far can I take it?
I definitely think of my stories usually as my version of something else. And then of course it turns out very different from that, whatever that seed text is. Like I already mentioned Foucault's Pendulum, but I also was really inspired by Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, which is about a plague, but I this was before COVID. There are also like a lot of weird things in my book that sort of came true, which is spooky when you're writing a book about divination, but this is like a whole other Zoom. Anyway, that was a story I was really thinking about, rich people partying while, people die all around them. And then Louise Welsh's book, Tamburlaine Must Die, which takes place in a single night. And I thought, oh, I want to do that. I bet, that's an exciting way to tell a story. I think it's kind of similar too to how we might think of genre, because I always think of genre not as a category, but as a set of tools. Like we were talking earlier about, how do you situate your devices and tropes in, the history of the use of those devices and tropes. But I think I also think of texts in the same way. And this is my version of this, or this is, kind of like a mutant version of that comp thing where you have to say, my book is, Twilight meets the Bible, or whatever is going to sell a lot of copies.
Yeah, I like that about the tools, because I think we're all, like you said, using those elements of mystery, the kind of questions that pull the reader forward into the book, and the psychological depth of, that we often think of as a literary realism thing, but, is employed just as well by someone like Ursula Le Guin or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think any writer should be kind of studying multiple genres to learn lessons from each of them and kind of pull some into whatever type of project you're working on.
Yeah. And, talking about tools, I actually just read something recently. I think it was actually a Kelly Link interview, but she was talking about how in genre fiction, at least, because you have such a range of elements there, you have a bigger palette in terms of tone. You can go from the eerie to like the ridiculous. You can go from terrifying to like more silly stuff. And I think that's really interesting. I love having a big palette to play with, and I think there are parts of my book that are, definitely more serious, but there's also like some zany stuff that happens, and that's really fun and exciting to do as a writer. Did you feel like you thought about tone a lot as you were working on your books, or kind of sliding in that kind of scale?
I thought a lot about atmosphere, especially because I was describing this, carnival over one night. I really wanted it to be kind of dreamy and creepy. That's what I was going for. Like everything is kind of like red and there's like a bass thumping like that. I don't have synesthesia, but I realize I sound like I do when I talk about that. But that was kind of the atmosphere that I was going to. I always wish that I could be funnier or funny in my work. I feel like, I can manage funny okay in real life, but I have a hard time getting into my writing. But it's so important. It's one of the things I love about Self-Portrait with Nothing is how you move between those registers.
Yeah.
I should also say to the audience that Stephanie totally nailed it on the tone.
It's so creepy. It's so creepy. It's really
like
good.
The most atmospheric book that I've read in years, and it's just like it feels like that, like a party in a collapsing world with this like dark magic being possible. So I really, really love that. In Singer Distance, at least for part one, it's a novel in 3 parts. I kind of realized early on I had some characters driving through the night, and there's this Stuart Dybek story called Paper Lantern, and it's also this couple on a night drive, and it's incredibly like intimate, as these, just like one of those things where people are driving through the middle of the night, having deep thoughts, talking about like the world around them, the world at large, their own relationship and stuff. So I was trying to kind of like import that atmosphere into the book. And I think that kind of kicked it off. And then the other sections were more reactions to that, where in part 2, things had to kind of turn south and not go as well for some of the characters. And so it was kind of like the bitter, slightly bitter flipped end of it. And Aimee, your book was really atmospheric too. I feel the word I was thinking while I was reading is there's a big sense of dislocation among a lot of the characters. Like you said, they feel like they're not living the life that they're supposed to, or something's out of place in it.
Yeah.
So what about you?
Yeah, I definitely do think like that's one of the reasons that I like using genre elements, is because like when you kind of create that sense of dislocation for the reader, when something really strange happens and it's unfamiliar, it's kind of a lens to see our reality more clearly. So I definitely did. And, I think most of the book is set in Wrocław, Poland, which is a kind of city with like a double life. It was destroyed and rebuilt, and kind of there were all these kind of layers of like doubleness, that I was kind of trying to build in. So that was a pretty natural fit for the story. Also, one of the most haunted places in Poland.
Yeah, that's right. That's mentioned.
Supposedly. Actually, I think it's funny, Stephanie, that you said about like the stuff coming true from your book, because I am working on a haunted house novel, and like some of the stuff is like coming true in my life, and I'm like, am I manifesting this by writing it?
Listen, it's scary. I'm like, bad things from my book came true.
Yeah.
Why are yet the good things come true?
But on the flip side, it makes it super relevant. So
yeah, that's true. I also wanted to confess. So Ethan, when I was reading your book, and it starts toward the beginning, we also get this history of the world, and we get the people on Earth, and I'm going to get the dates wrong, but I think it was like the late, like 19th century or something, when they had telescopes and they could see these channels on Mars. And there's, people are like, oh, they must be canals. Like, there must be Martians. They must have built these canals. And I remember like learning about that in real life. And so as you go on and you're like, and then one day, there were 2 parallel lines, or is it 3? I think it starts with 3 parallel lines. And so, on Earth, I don't want to give too much away, but on Earth we made 4, and then they responded, and that's how this communication started. And I was going, I don't that, how did I miss that? And I was like, oh wait, it's a book, it's a novel. And I think like some of what we're doing is just like writing with authority, and this is such a great example of that. And I tell it to my students all the time, like, if you can write with authority and directness, you can do anything in your book, and you can have Martians that are communicating, like very emotionally withholding Martians, and you can have doubles coming out of paintings, and you can have like little guys in jars, if you can make it believable and have that confidence in the page and in your prose.
Yeah, I always think about the metamorphosis, like that just starts out with like one day some guy woke up and was a bug. Like, how does he pull that off? He just does it. Like, he's not sweating it. He just puts it out there.
Yeah.
It is confidence.
Yeah. That's I feel like it's one of those hard things to develop, at least at first. Like, I remember as a younger writer trying to write something that's not in my experience with authority, and it felt like a cheap knockoff or something. And then I guess you just kind of work toward like faking it well enough and learning a few details. Like I've been asked a few times, like, how much do you know about math? Pretty much nothing. Like advanced math, I know very little, but you try to hear the ways some people who do understand it talk about it, and use that kind of voice and throw in a few selling details, and that can help it seem a lot more authoritative.
I don't know what you studied, but I think this is also part of my a result of my education in the humanities. You can like bullshit anything.
Yeah.
And fiction.
So I didn't do the reading.
Anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Aimee's book too, and that one's really grounded in history, like you were talking about, in Poland, and it feels very close. Did you go on a trip to Poland like for research, or have you been there? Or because it feels very lived in.
Yeah, no, a lot of the stuff in the first part of the book is based on my own experience. Like Pepper, the main character, is a forensic anthropologist. She's studying human skeletal remains that are archaic period. That is completely based on my own undergraduate research. Her mom's like have a veterinary hospital. I worked as a vet tech. Like that is all completely like real stuff that happened. Like we did have a dog who escaped and came back a week later with its tail, missing. But I have not been to Poland. My main research method is to go into like Yelp reviews of hotels and look at all the pictures. Like I was like deep into like the room service menus of like all the hotels in Poland. Yeah. I have not been there.
I definitely did some Google Map searching of like Flagstaff and other places. I was really nervous sending the book to Matt Bell, who was kind enough to give a blurb, because we sent it to him, and then I realized that a lot of this is describing the Arizona desert, and he's like always running out in the desert, and I'm like, it's gonna see through all my descriptions of the desert.
I did have a Polish reader and I was really sweating it, but she was like, "Oh, did you go to Poland?" And I was like, "I did not."
Did you seek out a Polish reader, or did she just happen to be Polish?
I know somebody who read it for me, which was nice. I did actually I did Polish Duolingo classes while I was writing it, which was fun, but I could recognize somebody speaking Polish, but I could say like 5 words of Polish. So more than that.
I cheated a little bit because I said Saturnalia in Philadelphia, where I grew up and where I live now. And I started writing it, and it's set downtown. I mean, so Nina goes on a very particular journey. Like I said, it's over one night. So she's really like from this neighborhood to that neighborhood to this street to this intersection. And I sort of did it all by memory and was like, well, I'll check it later. And then the pandemic happened and I thought, well, I can't leave my house. So I had to do a lot of like Google Maps.
That's funny. I think lived in is the word that Ethan used, and I feel like that about Saturnalia too. How much of the tarot, are you like an experienced tarot reader, or?
Experience is probably too strong a word. I sort of dabble, I guess, and have on and off for a long time. And I've been doing a little more now that, the book came out, and I like bought myself some tarot decks as celebration. But the deck in the book is invented, which was really fun. So I got to make up my own cards. And maybe that goes back to our earlier conversation too, about not, falling into things that have already been done. So I came up with I think about 10 cards. And I recently went back and I looked at my very first draft, and I had started out with 20 cards, and then some of them just never made it to the end. And I thought, oh man, I really should go back and make the whole deck.
I was going to ask about that. How many cards did you actually make up?
Yeah, I think there might be maybe 8 that are in the book, but there are the 5 main ones, and those have been the same this whole time. So part 1 is the drowning girl card, and part 2 is the Leyden jar, and part 3 is the Sphinx. So I had those 5 cards all from the beginning, and sort of developed them as I wrote, and how I could use their imagery and how they reflected Nina's character arc too in those different parts of the story.
So are we going to see the Feldman deck become a thing in the future of tarot?
God, I wish I could do any kind of visual art. And I described them really specifically in the book. So it's I said what they look like, and I was just I can't execute.
Same. I wanted to draw out some of the Martian writing, but I've got no graphic art skill at all.
I wrote a book about a painter, and I can't or paint at all. Yeah.
You've got a great painting cover.
It is so beautiful. Yeah. I really looked out on the cover situation. I think our covers look really good together too, seeing them together.
Oh,
I like Stephanie's interactive cover. I've seen you do it online, and I did it for my picture where it's got the woman with the plant head. So anytime you see a plant, you just
yeah. I've been putting out a book for anyone who's listening who hasn't done it. It sort of breaks your brain a little bit. And I just started taking selfies with plants on my head. Actually, Aimee, you kind of have a plant because you have a plant behind your head. So you got the vibe.
Yep.
It got me thinking about some other, you see it with covers that have a torso but no head, where people will do the thing like that. And it's got me on the lookout now for other covers that are interactive and stuff.
So I'm curious. I said, I think at the very beginning, that putting out my first book, The Angel of Losses, really changed how I thought about genre and how I thought about my own work. So is that something that you're experiencing now? Did you come into this thinking you had written one kind of book, or you were one kind of writer, and now maybe you're changing your mind?
For me, I'd say for a long time, I thought of myself kind of specifically as a literary writer. I was mostly writing in realism. And a handful of years back, I started feeling like I was more of a premise-based writer, and I wanted something that was kind of a twist on something. And sometimes I was realism or near realism, and sometimes it was a little farther out there. I didn't set out to write a sci-fi novel. I didn't like decide I'm going to write that and then look for an idea, but it was like, oh, that's the direction this idea goes. But I feel like that's probably going to keep happening, where there's a premise, some sort of twist on reality, because there's just so much you can do when you start to twist the world instead of just reflect it. I feel like you can do both at the same time in a really interesting way.
Yeah, it's weird because I somehow made it like all the way through 3 years of an MFA program without ever really realizing that there was like a divide between like genre and literary. Like, I'm not really sure how that happened, but all the writers that I read used these kind of, or the ones that I loved the most were using these fantastical elements, like Karen Russell and George Saunders. And I never felt like any, I was like turning in stories that was like a character's hair starts crying and nobody was like, hey, that doesn't belong here. And then I graduated and I was picked up this writing, like a fiction workshop that I was teaching, and somebody else, that I knew was supposed to teach it. And, he couldn't for whatever reason. And I was talking to him beforehand because he shared his syllabus. And I said, is there anything else I should know? And he said, oh yeah, watch out. Some of them are writing fantasy. And I was like, he said that in a kind of a derogatory way, and that was the first time that I was like, oh, wait, is that frowned upon? And I guess, I just feel like I'm kind of in the middle. Like, I feel like my book is sci-fi because it's published by a sci-fi publisher, but like, I don't really define it as one or the other in my head. And I'm not really trying to put definitions on what I'm working on now, though I am kind of in a little situation with that, kind of not so much like in what I'm writing, but like what readership am I trying to build, I think is kind of something that I'm asking myself at the moment. Yeah.
It is a very weird thing because there is so much great literature that is considered literary. I can't help but do like air quotes literary because I don't even know what it means anymore, but that's sort of like mainstream fiction. Anyway, that it does use fantastical elements and fabulism, like Karen Russell or Kelly Link, who I think sort of lives in both worlds. Because she's very at home among like the fantasy and people too. And so it is sort of confusing sometimes, like why one author or book is, being read and talked about in the literary circles and why someone else is being read in the sci-fi circles when really they are both the same almost genre-wise.
Yeah. And I feel like sometimes it's like a big literary person comes out with a book with like a genre element and they're like, this is a groundbreaking thing. And you're like, okay, congratulations, you invented science fiction. Like, it's been here the whole time.
Yeah, it's kind of inexplicable.
Yeah.
But yeah, and you do have to start thinking about it like a little strategically from a publishing point of view, like you said, like, what readership am I going after, or what publishers do I want to work with? And it's very confusing.
Yeah, it seems like there's a readership now for the hybrid type novel, or the thing that's working between spaces, but there's not a shelf for it, like in the bookstore, and there's not a like a marketing category specific to it. So it always just gets called like a hybrid or a blend or a genre bender. So I feel like are those readers who are looking forward, like the next Emily St. John Mandel novel or Ling Ma novel, or just you kind of, instead of getting the category, you get the comps, right? This is kind of like this author and this author and this author, but it's not as broad a shelving space as pure sci-fi or just literary. So it's kind of like, I think it's hard for everyone to know where to put it.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it, because I agree with you. Like, the readers are there. I mean, we're all those readers too, and those are, I think I find so many people who love books that are doing different things and working in non-realism.
All right. It's getting close.
Take some questions now.
Yeah, it's that time.
We don't have any questions just yet from our Q&A, but this is just my opportunity to remind those of you who are watching, please feel free to submit your questions for tonight's authors in the Q&A, and I'll be Happy to not to answer them. I won't be able to answer them, but happy to read them on your behalf. But I'm happy to turn it over to you, our authors. Once again, if you have any other questions you wanted to get to that you didn't get a chance to just yet, or pick up on any conversational threads you'd like to return to, and I'll pop back on when we have some questions from our audience.
I had one that's kind of related to what we were just talking about, which is how was it different at all? Or I guess for Aimee and I, it's our first book, so we would have to say different to what, but what was it like shopping a novel that's not in such a as clearly defined space? Was it, do you feel like that had an effect on how shopping it around worked?
It was hard. And, one of the things that my agent found, she said to me is that the literary editors, would get to the homunculus, the little guy in the jar, and it was like just too much. They could not, not that they liked it or didn't like it, but we're talking about marketing again, and how do we market this? What is it, And for genre editors, many of them thought it was too literary, which I don't know what that means. I don't know why that was a response. Maybe people were being polite, but it was hard. It was hard to find the right fit. And then once we started working with my publisher, which is Unnamed Press, they were like, oh yeah, this book is has such an easy hook, right? Because there's a carnival and there's tarot and whatever. And I was like, oh, like, thank you. Like, I think there's a hook to it also. And, it shows you how you really just need to find the right fit. And it's not that necessarily that one publisher is always good and one is not good, but you need to find the people that really understand what you're doing. And if you're working in a hybrid genre or in spec lit, like that can be tough.
Yeah, I had pretty much the exact same experience. And for my book, really, like the first 2/3 of the book, the kind of speculative element is just really like a rumor. There's no confirmation. And then, the last third, it comes, we go into like everything goes crazy. So it was the same experience where editors would like it, they'd like it, they'd get to that point and they'd be like, yep, too weird. And then when we finally did sell, and my editor at Tor.com, obviously was not fazed by those elements. I remember very specifically my agent talking to her on the phone and saying, yeah, if we had sold to a more literary or kind of like book club focused imprint, like the worry would always be that your next book might be too out there for them. And you're never going to out weird Lee. My editor's name's Lee. And that was like such a weirdly like liberating thing for me to hear. And I, it's not like I was waiting for someone to give me permission to like write weird stuff, but it was like, it did feel like I was being given permission to like go in whatever direction I wanted, which is, it's exciting, And I think even though like I was not like raised as a writer, I guess, in an atmosphere that was like hostile to genre, like you do kind of internalize like what it means to be, a respectable writer in some ways, and what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do.
I think my experience was also pretty much the same, and kind of a lot of the big publishers, it felt like the responses were like, we don't know exactly how this fits in with our list, because a lot of times they're trying to figure out, what's the thriller of the season going to be, what's the this or that category book of the season going to be, and with certain kind of more independent imprints, with independent publishers, it seems like they have more flexibility to just say, well, I love it, I feel like it's a good book, so let's go with it and figure it out.
I remember when I was first learning to be a writer and paying attention to the industry like 20 years ago, to publish with a small press was like career, I was going to say suicide, but maybe that's not a great term to use, but it was bad for you. It's like, once you're in the minor leagues, you'll never advance. And of course you want to advance. And now it seems like the smaller and independent presses are publishing the most interesting work and critically acclaimed work too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been great to see small presses on the and National Book Award long lists and stuff like that. It seems like it's happening a lot more recently.
Yeah.
We have time for maybe one question, and thank you to those viewers who sent questions in. And I think I'll turn to a question that's on theme here. A viewer writes, if you could go back to when you first started writing this book and give yourself one piece of advice about the process, what would it be? What it would be like from the start to the publication of your book? What would it be?
I would probably tell myself to have patience for that long road of trying to find the right publisher.
Yeah, I think when I started writing this, it took me 60,000 words, I think, of the first draft to really know who my main character was. And I just get so mad at myself because it's so inefficient to write that way. But, the more that I have written, I just realized like that's just my process. Like it is always a discovery process, no matter how much I plan and outline. And when I stop fighting that has helped a lot to enjoy the process of writing. So I think that would be my advice to myself, is just accept that you're an incredibly inefficient writer. Yeah.
For me, I'd say it would be probably a little more on the after the book deal side of things, just kind of to tell, like, say, it's still going to be a lot of work. It's going to keep you busy for a long time. Like there have been little lulls, but since the book deal, like it hasn't been like, oh, now set it down and work on the new book. It's been a lot of like, okay, here's the task for this week and here's the task for the next week and so on, and just keeping up with it. And so I think that was a little bit of a surprise to me. I'll know for the next book now. I guess it's good knowledge to have out there that the book process doesn't end with the finished manuscript. It keeps on going for a long time in a lot of good and exciting ways, but it will keep you going for a while.
Well, that's all the time we have this evening on At Home with Literati. Stephanie, Aimee, Ethan, thank you so much for joining us. You can purchase their books. You can purchase Singer Distance, Self-Portrait with Nothing, and Saturnalia from Literati Bookstore. There's links in the chat. There's also links in the description directly below me if you're watching on YouTube. We hope to have you all in the store for your next titles, hopefully in the not too distant future. And to all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. Have a great night all and take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.